right, thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. And this is, I know it's a little different than your usual talk at one of these things, but I've done it a few times here. Done a few of these at tech conferences, and to start off, I guess introduce myself. My name's Ed Finkler. Some people call me Funkatron because I have gone by that handle for a little while. And it's weird getting called not your name. I don't know, I find that odd, but eventually I got used to it. So if you're curious, I'm on Twitter at Funkatron. You can go to funkatron.com and look at stuff that I talk about or write about or things like that. And if you didn't remember, you are at the Dev Workshop Conference of 2014, and there's a hashtag if you really are into that. So I already kind of talked about who I am. I'm a dad and I'm a husband and developer type, and I've been that way for a long time. Been a developer for 17 years, I guess. Occasionally a musician, kind of a big nerdy type. I also have a mental illness, actually a couple. Some people call that comorbidity, which sounds very horrible, but that just means you have two things instead of one thing, or more than one thing. So I'm just a person, well, I guess like all of us, but I'm not a mental health professional. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not an expert. I am certified in something called Mental Health First Aid, which is a course you can take. But other than that, I'm just a person who has had a mental illness, or a couple, and I've been dealing with it since I was young, 12, 13, and kind of wanted to talk about that from my perspective as a developer and as a human being, I guess. I guess I want to do a little informal survey, and I'm kind of curious about how this works out for you. How many of you need glasses or contacts? So most of the people here need glasses or contacts. Let's call that 75%. And I'm curious, are any of you afraid to tell people that you need glasses or contacts? Not really. No, probably not. It might not be something you bring up all the time, but not something you necessarily fear. Have people ever said to you, I know you're having trouble seeing, bored, or maybe you're not trying hard enough. Have you tried harder? Curious. Has anybody ever heard that about their sight disability? Or have you tried squinting? Has anyone suggested that? Now, my father and my brother both have type 2 diabetes, and that's something. I'm curious if anybody who's maybe dealt with that or that's come up, would you be afraid to discuss that with somebody if it came up in conversation, or would that be something you wouldn't? I'm not comfortable with that. I don't want anybody to know about that kind of stuff. Please raise your hand. Yes, are you? All right. You're not following instructions. Come on. That's all right. My brother, who one of my brothers who has type 2 diabetes, also had cancer. I struggle with that, and it can be a scary thing. Used to be a few decades ago that cancer was not something you talked about. That was a pretty dark thing, and people didn't really want to discuss that. Nowadays, it seems like that's pretty open, and most people, while not exactly a fun topic to discuss, people aren't generally afraid to say something about it. If it does come up in conversation, might not be comfortable with it, but not necessarily worried about severe repercussions because of that kind of thing. Now, I'm curious though, and this will involve some hand raising, so get ready. Now, you don't have to say you have one, don't have to say anything about that kind of thing, but whether you do or don't, I'm curious how many of you would feel comfortable talking with your boss or supervisor, or imagine you have a boss or supervisor if you don't have one, about a mental health issue. Would any of you feel comfortable discussing that? This is the first time I've gotten to 0. Usually I have at least, say, 10% of people who say yes. How about a colleague, somebody you work with reasonably? Might discuss that with somebody, yeah, right. How about a friend or a family member, somebody you're relatively close to? So most people, 50-60% of folks here, out of a survey of 8. And I'm not sure how statistically significant that is, but I think that's interesting to think about that. And to think about that, put that in a perspective, sort of a societal thing, and talk a little bit about how it affects us as a culture, how it affects us as a society. 1 in 5 adults in the U.S. have a mental disorder in any one year. That's 20%. So it is extremely likely that if you do not deal with a mental disorder, it is extremely likely that somebody you run into every day, maybe in your family, maybe you work with, maybe you know, what have you, you are almost assuredly working with somebody who's struggling with that. The most common disorders are anxiety disorders. That's what I have. I have an anxiety disorder called generalized anxiety disorder. But they're the most common. There's depression, I think, is the second most common, substance abuse also, and a few things down the road. One of the things that's interesting to talk about is the level of disability, and because a lot of times there's sort of a perception that a mental health issue, a mental disorder, you know, well, what impact does that really have on people's ability to, say, do what we consider normal things in our society, be productive and things like that. So this is something coming from the World Health Organization, and they make a connections to kind of compare things. They would compare the level of disability that someone has with what they would call moderate depression. Would be similar to that with somebody who has multiple sclerosis or severe asthma. That has a pretty significant impact on your ability to function in a normal, let's say, neurotypical way or physically typical way. Now, severe depression would be something similar to quadriplegia. Severe depression, we see things like people who have motor retardation, unable to function effectively. And that kind of rolls into this idea of a global burden of disease and what the global burden of disease is of mental illnesses. And that's another thing that comes from this World Health Organization study that was released in 2004. When they talk about this idea of disease burden, and disease burden is essentially a combination of what different conditions what they cause premature death plus years lived with the disability, so that effectively how long does what's the disease burden like in terms of how long you're dealing with it and what kind of impact it has on your ability to do, again, sort of normal things, or how does it interrupt your ability to do things that you would normally do. So what's interesting about that is that the burden of mental disorders in North America is the largest of all disorder categories. It's more than cardiovascular disease, and it's more than cancer. Those are the second and third highest. And this is a quote from that Global Burden of Disease from WHO, that study. In all regions, neuropsychiatric conditions are the most important causes of disability, accounting for around 1/3 of years lost to disability among adults aged 15 and over. So what that means is that, and just think about this in the context of what we discussed about, and think about our comfort level about discussing this thing. Mental disorders, these kinds of conditions, in fact, have the most impact on our productivity as people, have the most impact on our productivity as part of teams, as part of families, as part of societies, as part of cultures. But we are more scared to talk about it than any of those other issues, than cancer, than heart disease, and than diabetes. It's an interesting thing to think about, and we'll kind of go into that some and talk about how it relates to the tech industry specifically. But I want to talk a little bit about my diagnoses, and like I said, I really have two things that I deal with primarily. The first one is generalized anxiety disorder, and I have depression as kind of part of that. It just turned green, didn't it? Let me see this. Oh, look at that. I better screw it in. So I have generalized anxiety disorder, and depression is part of that. Generalized anxiety disorder meaning that I sort of don't have specific things, like a very specific set of things that I get super freaked out about and have very severe reactions to. I have a lot of different things that I have severe reactions to. And I also have some, adult ADD, which is, they apparently call it adult ADD because it was just ADD. They usually meant kids. That's not really the case. It is not the case that somehow you magically get rid of that when you're not a kid. And I guess in some cases you've known to deal with it better and it changes, your brain function changes. But I have adult ADD, and I take some medication for that kind of stuff. And I take, every day I take Lexapro, which is an SSRI. a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which is the same class. Prozac was the first drug released in the market that was in that class. Lexapro is a descendant of that and does effectively the same thing. Buspar is another medication I take, which is an anti-anxiety medication, and also there seems to be interaction between that and make SSRIs more effective. Strattera is a medication to treat ADD. It is the only medication on the market in the U.S. that I know of, pretty sure, that is not an amphetamine. Everything else that you take for ADD that they'll give you at a doctor's office, like Adderall or anything, Ritalin or things like that, it's all speed. That is what they give you. Sort of not a cool thing to give to people who have anxiety disorders is speed, but it's so I can't really take that. Of course, strangely, my insurance thinks that I should pay 4 times as much for Strattera than anything else, and keep knocking it down. It's like, oh, maybe you should take one of these other cheaper drugs. And I'm like, yes, but I can't take that. But that's the way that usually goes. And I take Klonopin, which is a tranquilizer, a benzo similar to something like Xanax or things like that. Helps calm me down. I take that especially as needed, if in case I'm having some real freak out situation like that. I also see a therapist. I talk to a therapist about every 2 weeks, and that's not been consistent for my entire life. Recently I started seeing a therapist again, working with her primarily about anxiety issues and figuring out ways that how I can work through that kind of stuff. I talk about how I'm doing and what things I do and why I'm doing the things that I do, and we try to come up with strategies to address those things to sort of change the kinds of reactions that I have. Particularly with an anxiety disorder, a lot of times what you have is you have these very sort of hard-coded responses you have in your brain. They're very well worn, very practiced, and very quick responses, and you have to sort of find ways to short circuit that and go in a different direction. That's not always easy, but some people had a lot of success with that in terms of just with therapy. And if you haven't dealt with, say, one of the things that I deal with, or any kind of mental disorders, I think one of the things that's really important to remember is that people who deal with these kinds of things, like me, we don't present as sick. We don't look sick. Somebody wouldn't look at me and say, oh, he obviously has an anxiety disorder. Now, they might occasionally catch me at a bad time, and it looks like that. When they hear me talk, they may or may not realize that I'm having attention deficit disorder, but in general, you don't walk by somebody and say, oh, yes, he is obviously suffers from depression. Boy, look at the way he's limping. Or, well, look at this person wheezing into an oxygen tank, and a mask, and they obviously have some kind of like CPOD or something like that. We don't present as sick. And there are certain interesting consequences about that, I think, in terms of, are we really sick, or is this a real thing, or do we just need to try harder? And oftentimes there's a lack of sort of understanding about those kinds of things and how they affect us. And I think that the way that we appear has something to do with that. So anxiety is an interesting thing, and I think that the difference is that I think anxiety itself is a normal reaction to situations. And in fact, depression is the same kind of thing. It's your body having fight or flight reactions to different situations. And the difference is that with me, with generalized anxiety disorder, I have those reactions at times when they're not appropriate. And the severity level is very inappropriate for the actual, say, danger that I'm in. It is, the way that I might react to something if I'm having a really severe anxiety, it would be appropriate if, say, a lion were chasing me, or, there was a very serious potential threat to my physical well-being or something like that. It is not an appropriate reaction to say, hey, my supervisor sends me an email and says, hey, can I talk to you on Monday? And then I will, without working on this, I will tend to constantly worry about that. I will imagine the worst possible scenarios and get to a really bad place really quickly. That is, in fact, makes me unable to interact with people in a normal, positive way, and it makes me unable to do the things that I would normally do if I was not having those anxiety issues. I'm not able to be productive in a normal fashion. So again, it's sort of the level of it, and how does it get between like, well, I'm kind of nervous about this, or I have an anxiety disorder. It's really the frequency and the when it happens, the frequency of it, and the level of it. And the level of it for people who have anxiety disorders tends to be much higher. If you can imagine some of the most scared situations you've ever been in, if you have not had an anxiety disorder, what you would find is that you feel that way a lot. And that's interesting. You find yourself that you tolerate a sort of a base level of worry that is significantly higher than most people deal with at any given time. And I find talk about inappropriateness. I find I get scared to go to new places. I get scared to do things like ride public transportation because I don't understand exactly how it's going to work, and I feel like I'm going to put myself in a situation where I'm going to somehow embarrass myself, and that seems like a really, really horrible thing. And so I will simply not participate in the activity at all. I've been invited to give this talk overseas. I will not go overseas. I am scared to. I've been in places where people have said, like at work, they're like, "Hey, we think we're going to do a retreat, and we're going to do it like in Iceland," and everybody else is like, "That sounds awesome." And my first reaction, and immediate, is utter sheer panic. Sweating, my blood starts draining out of my face. It's bad, right? It's really bad. I don't have that reaction that's like, well, that would be exciting and someplace neat to go. I think, holy fuck, I don't know what I'm doing, and something horrible is going to happen. Even though I logically know that nothing horrible is going to happen. I'm very aware of that, but there's this other part of my brain which is causing this emotional and physical response in my body that is like pushing me as hard as it possibly can imagine in another direction. And that's really, really hard. And that's, that kind of deals somewhat with the intensity of emotion that I deal with. And a lot of times I find it's kind of like a wave that you have to ride out, and it's very hard to be able to stop it. When you get in a place like that, and when you get in this where your brain's effectively telling you that you should be very, very scared and that you are in great danger, and it is triggering all these physical responses in you. It floods your bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline, and you might start feeling faint, or you get cramps in your abdomen, or you feel sick to your stomach. Or for me, I feel sick to my stomach. It's really bad, but I get tightness in my chest, like I get a knot right underneath my sternum. When you're in a situation like that, it makes your best friends seem like enemies. It makes everything you enjoy seem useless and empty and worthless. Stuff that an hour ago you were really excited about doing, suddenly you have no interest in doing it. Now, I have ADD too, and that means I sometimes have problems focusing. It's better with medication. It's better with me trying to figure out how to deal with that stuff. And so I've had that problem a long time. And then kind of that goes along with this, that is part of having attention deficit disorder, is that combine that with anxiety, and it's really easy for me to have these spiraling chains of thought where you jump from this point to this point to this point to this point, where because your brain is so good at quickly changing state like that, I talked about the boss wants to talk to me. Well, I will within a few minutes construct a scenario where I and my family are going to be homeless. I'm going to lose my job. I'm never going to get another job again. We're going to lose the house. All this stuff's going to go bad, and it's just going to go to shit, and everything's gone. And I will get there really fast, really, really fast. I construct those outcomes incredibly fast. And when you have ADD and you have anxiety, you always have something to be afraid of. Your brain always constructs something to be afraid of. And it finds everything that it jumps to, it can say, oh, that reminds me of this. Oh, you know what? That reminds me of this. And every one of those things seems shitty. And it is really, really hard to break out of that, because when you're in that place, you feel like the whole world is just horrible. You feel like nothing's going to go right. And in fact, I have a tendency to obsess on negative events. Conflict is really upsetting to me. And even things I've had long in the past where I felt guilty, or I did something that I feel was a mistake, or I felt like I treated somebody incorrectly, or I didn't do a task that I was supposed to do. I have extreme trouble letting go of that, and I tend to bring it up in my mind and remind myself of it over and over and over. Things that I've done years ago, 20 years ago, 30, as a child. I still have things like that. And just seeing a person's name that I had a conflict with or something like that can trigger me really badly. Can throw me in a really bad place. When you're like that, and the tough thing that you get into when you are in a place where we're so often in our culture, where we don't want to talk about these things, it is really, really easy to feel like you're the only person who's like this. That everybody else seems like they're able to cope okay, and the way they present, it seems like they're getting along okay. But why can't I? Why can't I be like this person? And you feel, and ultimately, I learned after a while that, or I, was made to learn one way or another that I feel like I'm the only person who's like this, and you feel very disconnected from people because you feel like no one has that same experience as you, and so you feel alone, you feel unlike anyone else, and as this goes on, you end up feeling like you're just broken, like you cannot cope in society. That, when you're handed a task, sometimes you do really well on it, but then there's going to be something that comes along that's going to fuck it up, and you're going to lose your job, and people are going to get mad at you, and so things are always going to get screwed up, and you're never going to be right. You're never going to be able to cope with this stuff, and there's this utterly crushing loneliness that goes along with that. It's really tough. And that's where I think that anxiety and that ADD, that feeds into, especially as a teenager, but still throughout my adult life. I think it's gotten better, but that leads directly into just deep depression, feeling like just feelings of hopelessness and loneliness and disconnect from people. And that, to some extent, and not surprisingly, for a lot of people who suffer from depression, I, have had issues with suicidal thoughts, and I've had issues with self-mutilation, which are really different kinds of things. I still have scars from things I did to myself, and that stuff was not really, those were not attempts to end my life. Those were things that, for me, it was about really trying to express how I felt, because I did not know how to talk about it, because I did not feel like anybody understood. I didn't feel like they could relate to what I was going through. And one way or another, through the interactions that I had, I felt like I learned that people did not understand. But that was sort of a way where it was like I could express the weight of it, express the way that I felt. And it's a really, really fucked up way to do it, but the thing is, after a while, you sort of don't know what else to do. For me, real suicidal actions are rare. I have issues with ideation. If I feel really, really bad about myself, if I feel like if I'm feeling very cornered and very anxious and very upset, and I feel very, very bad about myself, that naturally my brain starts thinking about that kind of stuff. But the only times where I've actually attempted to do something like that were situations where it's extremely stressful and a couple very intense moments. Thankfully, haven't had a situation like that for many years. But it is a really, really hard place to be, and it is hard to understand if you haven't been through it, to just know how crippling and how crushing and how utterly alone you feel in those situations. And that really sucks. And it's hard to kind of know what to do with that. And this is a rough thing to talk about. And it's kind of demoralizing to talk about because it seems hopeless. But the thing is that we can't stay silent about this. And, I struggle with this a little bit because I think it's not an apples to apples comparison. But, we fight this by talking about it and not hiding it and not being ashamed and not being fearful. And there's a phrase that came up that's kind of been sticking in my head, is stronger than fear. And I've been thinking about that a lot. And it's that fear and that shame that divides us and disconnects us. And we need those connections. People are social beings. We evolved in such a way to be in groups and to share things with people. And so when you are disconnected by that shame, by that fear, by that silence, that is utterly unhealthy for us. It doesn't work. People don't work that way. And to borrow a term that, again, I'm not 100% comfortable with this, but to borrow a term from, if you know anything about early, mid, late 80s and the story of HIV in the United States, there was an organization, ACT UP New York, that created a slogan and a logo that said, "Silence equals death." And maybe it's not quite the same level of immediate morbidity, but there are people who suffer in silence for years and years and years and decades of their lives because we won't talk about this stuff, because they don't know where to get help, because they're too ashamed and scared, and maybe they've been taught that. And there are people who die because of it every day. And I guarantee you right now, there are people in your lives who are suffering with this stuff silently because they're afraid to talk about it. I know, because every time I give this talk, people come up to me and talk to me. And they don't present as sick. Every time I give this talk, people come up and talk to me, and they talk to me about their friends, and they talk to me about their family, and they talk about themselves. If we stay quiet, if we stay silent, it doesn't get better. They keep suffering. So as a developer, it's kind of interesting to think about what it's like dealing with mental illness. And a lot of times people ask me about situations like, well, do certain things appear more often within developer types or in the tech industry? And I don't have any information that's indicated that. So I don't know that it's like, oh yes, there's absolutely, definitely more ADD. Of course, developers are ADD and they have social anxiety and stuff like that. There's a lot of stereotypes that go into that, but I haven't actually seen any actual studies that say people who take this career, there is a significantly higher rate of depression or anxiety or ADD or psychosis or or substance abuse or any of that stuff. I don't think there's any evidence of that necessarily, but I think it's interesting to kind of think about it as a developer, as somebody I've taken on this role as an engineer, a web developer type. And the funny thing is, there's actually some positives about it. This thing's just a theory, but there's some people who believe that say attention deficit disorder is actually a technique that, or not a technique, but it is a way that the brain processes stuff that evolved because it was of use in certain kinds of societies and the roles that certain people would play in societies in prehistoric times. Who the hell knows? I mean, it's not like we had cameras and fucking videotape and shit then, so it's just making stuff up, basically. But it's kind of interesting that I think a lot of the stuff that causes me to be to think of bad outcomes quickly, to be able to process stuff, like to go in bad places fast, are also things that help me as a developer. I'm really good at quickly pattern matching, and human brains are basically extremely good at pattern matching. That's one of the things that we do and that most computers can't match, is how fast we pattern match. And we can recognize certain kinds of patterns, like things that look like faces and things that look like this or that, and that's why we attribute meaning to things like that. We see this thing where it's a picture that kind of looks like a face on Mars. Well, it looks like a face to us because we pattern match on human faces and things like that. And we can do that way better than anything else we know. And I'm pretty good at it. I find that within certain kinds of pattern matching and certain kinds of stuff, if I understand how that's going to work, it's really easy for me to take it as the way that something's been solved before and then take that and apply it to a new area. I'm really good at that. That's just something I'm very good at. I'm really good at anticipating potential outcomes quickly. Like, okay, if we do this, well, what kind of consequences is that going to have down here, A, B, C, D? And that is a direct outcome, I know, of the level of the kinds of things that also cause me lots of anxiety, and also my ADD, because I can say, oh, well, you know what? That reminds me of this, 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 and this, and those four things are going to be connected to this problem. So if we do this and we don't, say, filter the input properly or escape output or do other kinds of security, particularly with security stuff, I can anticipate that kind of stuff and says, oh, that's going to have a consequence here, 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 and here. And this is something I'm good at, and I think I'm good at it for the same reason I have the problems that I have. I think I'm good at being an empathetic and a supportive colleague. I think I was kind of taught that to be that as a kid. I think it's something you learn to be empathetic, and that's not easy, and you really do have to learn it. But I try to be very understanding of that and some of the stuff that I've dealt with. It's made me acutely aware of what kinds of pain people might be going through that they're not showing. And I get a lot of reward out of helping people. That really makes me feel good. And just directly impacting, say, a single person's life, making their life a little easier, allowing them to do a task that was harder for them before or impossible, that's really, really valuable and really rewarding to me. And I think empathy to users and trying to anticipate how things are going to impact them and trying to think about from their perspective on stuff. I mean, ultimately, most of the things that we make are things that are interacted with on a end user level, not on some kind of high-tech mentat kind of type, but actually by a person who just is trying to accomplish a task and is not necessarily concerned about how the thing was created. That's the end. That at the end of it, we're trying to empower people to do things with the tools that we create, and the ability to be empathetic towards the users of our tools is really essential to being a good developer, I think. One of the things that I think is interesting to talk about, has come up a lot when I've given this talk more and more, has been interviewing for new jobs and how scared people are to bring up these kinds of things, even though they know they have a significant impact on their lives. Because I know the kind of things I think about when I go to a new job are these people going to be cool about this if I am kind of having a bad day and maybe need to take a little bit of time? Or am I going to have to lie and say I have the flu? What kind of insurance support do they have for those kinds of things? And you wonder about things like, can I bring it up indirectly somehow? Like, you ask questions like, I ask a lot of stuff when I'm interviewing, like what's the work environment like? How often do you stay late? When did you last work from home? Is it cool to work from home? What if you're not doing so well and you need to take a little time, like a few hours off in the afternoon every once in a while? Is that a big deal? Because you're afraid to come out and say, oh God, I don't want to, say, oh, by the way, I have a mental issue, I have a mental illness, I have a mental disorder, things like that. And for a lot of people, we're going to be fine with that. And a lot of people are going to be like, I don't know what the hell you're talking about, and that scares the shit out of me, because they don't know how to handle it. And they're certainly not used to anybody talking openly about it. I've been really lucky that I've had relatively understanding managers and bosses types, those kind of roles in my life, and that has changed the quality of my life dramatically. And I'm curious if any of you are a team lead, oversee anybody, thing like that. This guy here, so we'll pick on him a little bit. It's interesting, but in a role of a team lead, in a role of a manager, or things like that, you have a deep ability to impact the quality of life for the people who work with you and that you oversee. And people attempting to be empathetic and attempting to accommodate the things that I'm dealing with has dramatically increased the quality of my life. And when I've been in situations, not too often, but when I've been in situations where people were not understanding, it dramatically worsened the quality of my life. It had a huge impact on that. So to kind of go into that, one of the things I've been trying to talk about more when I do this talk is how you make your workplace a safe place to talk about this stuff. And one of the things to give you some context about it is some survey results. I did a survey I just kind of pushed out, try to get people doing it on Twitter and Facebook and stuff like that. And I did that this summer. So these are survey results that I did from this, and there were some issues with the questions I asked. It was really U.S. centric. It didn't really take well into account people who are self-employed and things like that. How many of you are self-employed? So nobody, y'all work for some agency, some organization, and things like that. Okay. So the results that I'm presenting here are just the people who are in the U.S. and just non-self-employed people. I had a total of like about 1,200 responses. So this is just a portion. It's probably 700 or 800 who are in the U.S. and just self-employed. Now, this was as of a couple weeks ago. There's probably a few more things that have trickled in since then. But if you really want to read a little bit more about it, there's a link there. So there's a few slides here I'll show you, and these are the results that we got back from this stuff. So the first question was, do you feel that your employer takes mental health as seriously as physical health? And so, hey, half of them think so. I would say, don't know counts like a no to me, because if I don't know, I would be concerned about that. But generally, I would feel like the organization is not doing a good job in terms of indicating that they can take mental health as seriously as physical health. So that's an interesting thing. So I asked, do you think that discussing a health issue with your employer would have negative consequences? And this is a comparison directly between physical and mental health. Physical health, no was over 3/4, and you had maybe at 20%. So only 4% of people felt like if I discussed a physical health problem with my employer that there would be negative consequences. Mental health, only about 1/3 of people could say definitively no, there's not going to be. 25% of people, about 1/4 of them, said yes, I absolutely believe that if I discuss this with my employer, there will be negative consequences. And maybe, which is, that's not a good place to be. That is 2/5? Yeah. So, that's a lot. And that shows you, I think, starkly the differences between how we treat, and this is just in tech, how we perceive physical health and mental health. So another one comparing physical and mental health. Would you bring up a health issue with a potential employer in an interview? Physical health, no, 44%, so this would certainly a lot of people who, I don't think I would do that, and yes is 12%, only 12%, but maybe that could be a lot of things. It'd be like, well, you know what, I've got a bum knee, and maybe it doesn't even come up, and maybe it's like, why would I bring that up? And then maybe it's also like, I don't want to bring it up. You could, one of the things I haven't accounted for in here was gender. There are certainly lots of cases where particularly women don't want to discuss a potential pregnancy in an interview because there are plenty of examples that, if you haven't heard of personally, plenty of evidence that will get you, it will eliminate you from consideration for a job almost immediately. In a lot of cases. But the really scary thing is that they say with physical health, the no is 44%, and I apologize because I wish these colors corresponded. But the no in mental health, when I bring this up, is 85%. And the maybe is 14%. Only 2% of people would bring it up in an interview. That is orders of magnitude less. And I think that, again, starkly shows how differently we consider and we treat in our society mental health compared to physical health. And yet, mental health is the largest source of disability in North America. Yet we don't want to talk about it, even though it is by far the largest. That's a hard thing to deal with. What are we doing in our organizations? What are we doing in our society that we treat it like this? Does your employer provide mental health benefits? Yes, pretty good. Yes, 55%. 12% no. That's a bummer. I don't know. I don't think I asked, do they provide physical health benefits? So it could be, that 12% could be, well, they don't provide any benefits at all. That doesn't surprise me. Lots of places don't provide any benefits at all. Don't know is disturbing because 1/3 of people have no idea. And I guarantee you, in that third, there are people who are dealing with mental health disorders and don't know. They don't know if they have coverage. If they don't know they don't have coverage, they certainly aren't going to know how to get help. Right? Do you know the options for mental health care that your employer provides? Not sure, 27%, which kind of sounds like a no to me. But maybe they know a little bit or something like that. No, 33%, they don't know the options. Certainly within that group, there's people there who are dealing with it. They don't know how to get help. And in this country, the help that you get, the medical help that you get, is primarily provided through your employer, for better or for worse. So that's a lot of people who don't know how to get help for the thing that causes the largest amount of disability in the United States, or in North America. Has your employer ever discussed mental health as part of an employee wellness program? If I include don't know in that, I hope I would have heard about that. Maybe those are new people. You're closing in at least 2/3. At least 2/3 of people have never heard their mental health come up. Have all of you had like some wellness program done in your organization? Have any of you? Okay. So it's kind of a common thing. You see it with larger organizations. Like when I worked at Purdue University, they had this stuff where basically, because they want to lower healthcare costs, that's the big motivator, and also potentially things like legal issues or legal expenses and things like that, they try to encourage you to do things like exercise and eat better and take the stairs and stuff like that. So that's a really common thing you'll see with large organizations. So does your employer provide resources to learn more about mental health issues and how to seek help? So a quarter of them do. Don't know is pretty big. I would say that if you're thinking about discoverability, if over 1/3 of people don't know, I would count that as a fail. And if you do have programs and you're not getting them out there, and almost 40% say no. Again, this is the largest cause of disability in the United States, or North America. And for the most part, our employers and the organizations we work for that we make up aren't doing things to really help. Here's an important one. Is your anonymity protected if you choose to take advantage of mental health or substance abuse treatment resources? Yes, 30%. Don't know is 68%. So if you don't know, that would be a concerning thing for me. How easy is it for you to take medical leave for a mental health condition? Very easy is green, and that's 13. Somewhat easy is this orangish color, somewhat easy. So I can do math. That's about 1/3. And then you've got a solid 14% who say it's somewhat difficult or very difficult. They're pretty sure maybe they've explored that. But over half people have no idea. No idea if that's something they could do. Don't know. And at the end of the day, the problem here is that sick workers don't work. If you want to get down to, nuts and bolts, and you're just thinking about an organization, and you're thinking about the money issues of it and things like that, as opposed to just say, thinking about it like a caring human being, but thinking about it from the perspective of just productivity and are we being as successful as an organization and the purpose of the organization. But employees who are sick don't work. They either work at a much lower pace or much lower rates, their productivity is decreased or eliminated entirely. So they're significantly less productive or not productive at all. 41% is the number of people, there's a percentage of people in the U.S. with a mental disorder who receive professional help in a given year. So that tells me that most people aren't getting help. And why aren't they getting help? Well, let's see. Help is mostly, you're going to find out information because insurance and medical coverage is provided by the employer. Is the employer talking about this? Is it okay to talk about this in that context? The information I have is that they're not, or certainly not anywhere near the degree that they're okay with talking about it with physical illness. The interesting thing is that peers help. There's good evidence that peers help, that people with mental health problems are more likely to seek help if someone close to them suggests it. So if we are, in the social groups that we have at work or not at work or things like that, if we can be encouraging, if we can talk about these things openly, we can help each other get help. There's a lot of stigma out there. There's a lot of fear that you're going to get found out. But if somebody tells you, no, it's okay, you can do it, and I'm with you, dude, it's all right, I'm with you, there's a better chance they're going to actually go and get help. Because what happens is that they usually don't. There's a number I saw, Half the people with depressive disorders, I think this is in the US, it takes them 8 years to get any help for it. 8 years that they're suffering with this, and they don't get any help. And it's deeply upsetting to me personally that that's the case. There's a program called Mental Health First Aid, and I have taken this. I've gotten certified. It took me a day. And I really believe strongly in this program. It does not turn you into a psychiatrist. It does not get you into a place where you can diagnose people, because you should not be doing that because you are not trained to do that. Unless any of you also have, mental health degrees, and I forgive you if I was wrong about that. I really believe strongly, though, that this is the single biggest thing that you can do in the organization you're in the social group that you're in, at least getting one person in your company. Hopefully somebody who's in a position of leadership or management, because I think the direct impact you can have on people is stronger. You have an ability to you have a great impact on people's, the happiness of people's lives when you're in a position like that. So being trained to talk to people, to listen with empathy and non-judgmentally, to assess situations, see if there's see if there's a crisis situation and you need to get help immediately, or if not, talk about and encourage ways to seek help. Those things are all enormously powerful. And just having a single person in a group of, say, 20 or so that you can talk to as an employee at a place, I think is enormously helpful. And frankly, I think will be used far more than any other first aid programs. Now, it's not a bad idea to learn how to do CPR and other things like that. That stuff is all super cool. I think it is far more likely that you have somebody right now who could benefit from somebody who's able to listen non-judgmentally, who's able to encourage them to seek help, who's able to help them find resources. You could do that right now and make a serious impact and positively in somebody's life. It's really cheap. It cost me $50 to do it, and it was 8 hours. And I've been dealing, with this stuff for nearly 30 years. And there was a ton of stuff that I learned about how to talk to people, how to work with people. I thought I had a pretty good handle on it, and there was a ton of stuff that I learned that I didn't understand, particularly about disorders that aren't things that I deal with, and also the ways to learn, ways to speak with people, what to do, what not to do, how to interact with people who may be in a crisis situation. All of those things are just extremely helpful. Tons of good information in it, and it's very inexpensive to take. So I guess the key thing with all this, I really feel that's the biggest thing that you can do, and it's an easy thing to do. But I need your help with this stuff, and I need you to talk about this stuff, and I need you to share this stuff, and I need you to learn about this stuff, because I think it's important. I think it's important, and I think all the evidence that I've presented here indicates that it's extremely important, not just to me, but to our society as a whole. Now, I know about tech, and I know about open source. Those are the communities that I am in, so that I talk about it in those communities. But I know that there's things that we can be doing a lot better here, to try to eliminate this stuff. I just want you, if you can talk, if you can email, you can tweet about it, you can post about it, just do it now, please. If anything I've shown here, any of these URLs or messages or words or anything that I've said means something and has touched you or made you think about somebody who you know or somebody who you knew in the past, I guarantee you there are way more people that you don't know about who are afraid to talk about this. And you can make a huge difference in their lives. So these three, I have a little blog, osmehelp.org. Prompt is a campaign by Engine Yard. You may have heard of the company Engine Yard. They have sponsored me to speak at a bunch of different talks, paid for my airfare and hotel, stuff like that. And then mentalhealthfirstaid.org is the U.S. national site for mental health first aid. And they can help you find resources. I went to Mental Health America in Lafayette and got certified there. I guarantee you there's plenty of places in Indianapolis, and you're going to be able to find something nearby. Some places you can get it done for free. as some places will help you. I think that if you're in a position, I would really highly encourage you to go back to the organization you work in, and if you feel comfortable with it, bring this up to your supervisor, bring this up to your HR people, and ask, can we please get somebody certified in this? Because I know it's going to make an impact. My slides are already up. You can go see them if you want to. Or you go to osmehelp.org, you click on talks, you can get all my slides and videos from every one of these things that I've given. There's about 14 of them right now. So thank you for listening. Again, you can check these links out. That's great. That's my talk. Thanks for listening. Appreciate it.